On August 1, 2025, the US-Canada economic partnership was rocked when the Trump administration abruptly raised tariffs on Canadian goods from 25% to 35%. The move followed failed negotiations in Washington, blindsiding industries and communities reliant on cross-border trade. For decades, the two nations shared a seamless economic relationship. Now, chaos and uncertainty replaced predictability. This wasn't a targeted measure. It was a sweeping blow that upended the spirit of the USMCA and decades of cooperation. Trucks were stalled at the border, factories scrambled, and farmers feared losing their largest market overnight. The White House claimed national security concerns, but many saw the action as a betrayal. The foundation of US-Canada trade was shaken, and the immediate fallout was undeniable. The question on everyone's mind: what could possibly justify such a drastic move? The Trump administration justified the tariffs by invoking a national emergency, blaming Canada for the flow of illicit fentanyl into the US. Officials claimed the tariffs were a response to a critical security threat, linking trade penalties to the opioid crisis, but US law enforcement data showed less than 1% of seized fentanyl came from Canada. Most originated in China or Mexico. Critics quickly labeled the rationale a smokescreen for protectionism. President Trump further muddied the waters by tying the tariffs to Canada's support for Palestinian statehood at the UN, suggesting political retaliation. The use of a public health crisis as cover for economic penalties was widely condemned. Canadian officials highlighted their ongoing cooperation with US agencies to combat drug trafficking. The evidence pointed to a pretext, not a genuine security concern. Canada's response was swift and resolute. Prime Minister Mark Carney condemned the tariffs as baseless, reaffirming Canada's commitment to the USMCA and cross-border cooperation. Canadian officials detailed major investments in border security and intelligence sharing, directly challenging the White House's narrative. Beyond words, Canada launched a two-pronged strategy: immediate aid for affected industries, and a long-term push to reduce reliance on the U.S. emergency relief packages targeted auto, steel, aluminum, and agriculture sectors, aiming to protect jobs and stabilize communities. Simultaneously, the government accelerated efforts to diversify exports, fast-tracking trade talks with Europe and Asia-Pacific partners. The Buy Canadian campaign encouraged citizens and businesses to prioritize domestic products. The goal: ensure Canada would never again be so vulnerable to a single trading partner's political whims. This marked a fundamental shift in Canada's global economic strategy. The message was clear: Canada would not be bullied. The 35% tariff sent shockwaves through Canada's core industries, threatening supply chains built over decades. Ontario's auto sector, deeply integrated with U.S. manufacturers, faced production slowdowns and potential job losses. Steel and aluminum were hit even harder, with combined tariffs making Canadian metals uncompetitive in the U.S. market. Communities like Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie faced existential threats as factories teetered on the brink. Agriculture was also reeling. Farmers suddenly lost access to their largest export market, jeopardizing livelihoods and food supply chains. The uncertainty paralyzed planning, leaving families and businesses in limbo. Unions and business groups described the crisis as the fight of our lives. The impact wasn't just economic, it threatened the stability of entire regions. For millions of Canadians, prosperity was now at risk. The tariffs weren't just numbers, they were a direct assault on daily life. The stakes had never been higher. While Canada faced harsh tariffs, Mexico received a 90-day extension in its trade talks with the U.S. This disparity highlighted a transactional, personality-driven approach to foreign policy. Analysts pointed to two factors: the Trump administration's praise for Mexico's border cooperation, and the personal rapport between Trump and President Sheinbaum. A direct call between the leaders reportedly secured Mexico's reprieve. For Canada, the message was clear. Trade policy was now subject to political whims and personal relationships. The U.S. actions implied Canada was being punished more severely, despite a stable, less contentious border. This fractured the USMCA's unified front, turning the partnership into a series of bilateral power plays. Canada now faced a volatile environment where alliances could shift overnight. The rules of North American trade had changed, and not in Canada's favor. The tariffs sparked a rare wave of national unity in Canada. Political leaders from all parties set aside differences to oppose the U.S. measures, presenting a united front. Even fierce critics of the government called for tough retaliation, echoing the need to protect Canadian workers. Labor unions and business groups, often at odds, joined forces to condemn the tariffs and the White House's justification. The Buy Canadian movement gained momentum as citizens rallied to support local businesses. The sense of being unfairly targeted galvanized public resolve. This crisis became a defining moment for Canadian identity, defiant, resilient, and determined to chart its own course. The U.S. pressure campaign had backfired, strengthening Canada's resolve. Economic patriotism was now a national rallying cry. The U.S.-Canada trade relationship stands at a crossroads. The tariff escalation threatens to unravel a century of cooperation and could spiral into a damaging trade war. Both economies are so intertwined that punishing one inevitably hurts the other. The crisis has forced Canada to urgently diversify its trade, seeking new markets in Europe and Asia. This pivot could permanently reshape North American commerce, making Canada less dependent on U.S. politics. The future hinges on whether both nations can restore trust and roll back the tariffs. A failure to find common ground risks a permanent rift, replacing partnership with suspicion. The choices made now will define the fate of North America's most successful economic alliance.